I've recently moved all of my fabric out of the closet and into a cube storage system. I don't have it quite organized yet, but I also wanted my fat quarters to be out here too, right next to my cutting table, so that I could just pull a box out, pull out what I wanted. The fat quarter system I used before was in a zippered CD case, and it works well for portability. But every time I wanted to go through my fat quarters, I had to pull the zippered cases out and unzip it, open it up, look at my fat quarters. Even though it had a clear vinyl side to it, I just couldn't pull out what I wanted easily. And I just wanted some little drawers or little boxes just to pull out of my cube shelf, and I wanted everything to fit perfectly. I was having difficulty finding boxes the exact size I wanted. I was able to find half-size baskets, but I wasn't able to get two of them in there. And I was also able to find some of these little rectangular boxes that were clear, but again, I could not fit four of them in there. And so I tried fabric boxes, and they work well, but I really like plastic canvas projects. So I thought, well, I've got so much yarn that matches my room. I'm going to use up my scrap yarn and just make my own little boxes that I can custom size for my shelf or my cubes. And when I want to look at my fat quarters, all I have to do is pull out a box, and my cutting table's right here. I just can kind of mess through them and see at a glance without having to go to the closet, and try to see in that dark space to see my fabrics. At this point, I could easily add a little rope handle or something like that, but I probably won't add anything to mine. And you can also cut out a little window out of plastic canvas and make a little label holder if you want to do that. But I probably won't do that either. I may in the future, but right now I'm just trying to get all the boxes made that I need. The first box that I made was out of cotton yarn, and I decorated the entire box. It took a lot of time to do that, even though I really like this design that I used. There was no need for me to decorate the whole box because it's not going to be sitting out where anybody could see it. And the only thing that's really going to show is the end of the box. So I decided not to go through all the trouble of doing a fancy design on my additional boxes. And also the cotton yarn was really hard to work with. If you were sharing a hole like I am here, the cotton yarn did not want to pass through very easily if there was already a piece of yarn in there. And it shed all over my clothes, and I got ready for church. I was stitching before church, and my husband said, "You've got stuff all over your clothes." So anyway, I like the acrylic yarn better, and I'm using some yarn I already had that matches my sewing room, and it's the Hobby Lobby. I love this yarn, and it's a variegated yarn, which makes a really nice, interesting design, and it matches everything I already have. For those of you who already know how to do plastic canvas and how to do those projects, I just wanted to give you the measurements right off the bat so you don't have to watch the whole video, because it can get quite long. So I decorated only the end panel because that was the only thing that's going to be showing on the shelf, but you can decorate all the sides if you want to. This piece here is optional, and that was the little divider that I sewed into the middle of the bottom of the box. So it helps support the box, and it also helps it to keep the fat quarters from falling over if you don't have your box full of fabric. It's an optional piece. So the reason the sides are a different size as the bottom is because I wanted to try to utilize as much of the plastic canvas as possible. And the plastic canvas sheet that I bought from Amazon was about, I want to say about 12 inches long by 10 and something wide. And it was 70 holes. But as you know, when you slice through the plastic canvas, you lose a hole. So I ended up with one sheet of plastic canvas. I was able to cut 34 holes by 78 holes. And these measurements are not exact because it's hard to measure plastic canvas. So if your cube or your shelf is a little bit different size, you can adjust the measurements accordingly. And then you can also cut them the same size as the bottom to save confusion, but I was able to save a lot of plastic canvas waste by doing it this way. So I got these two pieces cut out of one piece of plastic canvas, and the bottom was 35 holes by 78 holes, and then this side is the same as this one over here. So I decorated one end piece, and the end piece is 35 holes because it has to match up with the bottom. So it's 35 holes by 34 holes tall. So all of these sides are going to be 34 holes tall. And then the divider in the middle ends up the same size as one of these ends. But what I've done with those, since after cutting two pieces of plastic canvas, I didn't have enough left over to cut that, so I used the scraps, and I would just stitch 2 or 3 of them together and make a little divider. And the divider doesn't have to go all the way to the top, so it's basically just something to help support the sides, and it also helps to support the fat quarters. All right, so okay, you'll need 2 of these sheets here. This one's about 10 by 13, and I believe it's a 7 mesh. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of a strip. On all of them you have to cut off 12 holes, so it's easier for me to count rather than measure on this one. So I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to get rid of 12 holes on the length of all of them. Trying to see around the camera. So I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to measure. I've turned it like this, where the long way is this way. And I'm going to measure 5 inches over. And it just so happens to land on one of those vertical lines or solid lines. And that's going to give me 34 holes on one side and 35 holes on the other. The 34 hole by 78, it'll end up 78 holes this way. That's going to be my sides. So I need 2 sides and a bottom, and then with the leftover I'm going to make 2 end pieces. So let me go ahead, and I want to preserve 34 holes. I'm going to hold this up where I can see it. Alright, so that's one of my sides. So I get a little bucket here and I get rid of all these little doodads. That's the one hole that we lost. You always lose a hole in the middle. So that one is going to be the bottom because it's 35 wide, so I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to get another panel. First thing is going to cut the 12 holes off the end. And then, just like before, I turn it that way, measure out 5 inches so I can get 34 holes. If I were doing this assembly line style, I would just take a whole stack of them and cut the 12 holes off at the end, get that over with. Alright, so that's my second side, so I've got 2 sides and a bottom. So I need the end walls. what I'm talking about is this wall right here. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and cut all those little doodads off again. And then I'm going to measure, here's my long end, this is 35 wide. I'm going to turn it and measure out the 5 inches. And then 5 inches from the other end. And I'm just going to get rid of the middle. That gives me a clean cut on either side. So I want to retain the 34 holes. So I'm going to cut, preserving that little wall. Sorry, I gotta see, gotta lean it toward me so I can see. So that's one of my ends. And then I want to preserve the 34 holes that way. And I just have that left over from both pieces of canvas. With the little strips that I had left over, I sewed several of them together. If you can see my seams in there, and I used that as a little dividing wall. If your bin is not filled up, it helps to keep the fat quarters from falling over, and it also helps to support the walls on the side. So I found that on one of them I made, you didn't really need it, but I like having that in there. So you can save your scraps, and they don't necessarily have to be the whole depth. You can actually just sew in a little piece like this toward the top, and that will be sufficient. You're going to choose your plastic canvas stitch based on how many holes you have on yours and what you desire, but I'm just going to kind of show how I did mine. Since my end piece is 35 holes wide and 34 holes tall, it worked out perfectly for me to do this little chevron pattern. They're 4 rows wide, and the next row shares the same hole as the previous row, and I just angled them in a different direction for interest. And so the math just worked out perfectly for me to have this 4-hole or 4-row repeat. And so if you're doing the same pattern as I am, then yours will come out like this. So the way I started that, I made sure that because it's hard to tell when you're only 1 hole off, make sure you have your 35 holes going this way. And I just started in one corner. I use about 2 yards of yarn because I don't want to have to cut the yarn very often. So I found on plastic canvas, if you're stitching diagonally, it gives you better coverage on the plastic canvas, and so you don't see as much plastic canvas showing through. And that also depends on the thickness of your yarn. Alright, so the first stitch I'm going to make is going to be across diagonally 2 holes. And I'll try to stay in the camera, but I just hold the yarn on the back and I go across. And I like to wrap around rather than going to the nearest hole. Instead of just going here, I like to completely wrap and wrap and wrap. So if I went in at the top, I'm going to continue that on every row. I'll do it the same. So I'm going to go up to this next hole. So that's going to be the 3rd hole up. And then I go down diagonally. So now I'm spanning 3 holes. And then I go back to the top and I'm going to span 4 holes. 1, 2, 3, 4 this time. And that's going to be my 4-row span. And from now on, I'm not going to go up to the next hole because then that would make it 5 holes diagonally. So I'm going to stay on this same level across the whole piece. And it's always going to be 4 holes maximum. So when I get to the end, when I get all the way to the end here, Now I'm going to have to fill up these 3 holes and then these 2 across the bottom, and then I'll pass my thread under and then go work backwards to the other side. So let me get to the end of this and I'll be right back. Alright, so now I'm at the other end, and so I need to go across 3 holes. I think I showed you the wrong thing. If you end with your stitches down here, you may want to run your thread under before you jump up to the next row. So now I'm doing 2 holes. So they're getting shorter and shorter, but I'm still not going above this line right here. So I can turn it to make it easier. And so now I want to angle the other way. So I'm going to go across 2 holes, 3 holes, and then 4 holes, and then continue across and do the exact same thing over and over again. So that's how I got the little chevron. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because the video is going to be long, and you're going to decorate yours however you want. And there's lots of videos online showing how to do plastic canvas. So now I'm at 1, 2, 3, 4 holes. So I'm going to continue and do just 4 holes diagonally. I want to mention this again, I am sharing the same hole on the previous row. So when I come back underneath, I'm sharing the same hole as a stitch that's already in there. So you'll do that throughout the whole project. And that gives you better coverage. If you didn't share the same hole, you would see some of the plastic canvas there, but it would give you an opportunity to maybe do some sort of a horizontal line, which would be cute. When your yarn gets too short to use, just turn it over, and it's going to be almost impossible to make the back look as good as the front, but it doesn't matter in this case. A lot of plastic canvas projects will have you sandwich your plastic canvas and make it look good on the back, but I'm just going to run my yarn through a few stitches and then just trim it off. So I've threaded up with a new piece of yarn, so all I have to do is turn this over to the back. And sometimes it's hard to tell the back from the front, but I usually look for my little fuzzies. And I'm going to go, I can go under the white or the blue, but I don't want to accidentally pull that tail out that I've already got in the white. So I'm just going to run my stitches under here and come out pretty close to where I need to start again. And I'll leave a little bit sticking out so I can kind of pinch that and hold on to it so I don't lose it or accidentally pull it out. So I'm back on the pretty side of my work. So I'm just going to continue on, but I like to be careful when I'm changing yarn. Sometimes I'll make a mistake and go through the wrong hole. So I want to study where the last one ended and make sure I'm still at a diagonal 1, 2, 3, 4 holes, because this is where I usually make my mistakes and go into the wrong hole, and I don't realize it until I get all the way to the end of that row, and then I have to rip out a whole bunch of stitches. So I'm still on track here, and I'm going to finish covering this whole piece, and I'll be right back whenever I am ready to do the construction. Alright, I finished all my pieces. I've got my 2 sides and my bottom, and the sides are a little bit shorter so I can keep that straight. So I'm going to take the 2 sides and just lay them out. I like to have everything laying out so I can make sure I stay straight. So I've got my 2 end pieces. Let's see if I can get this a little bit wider. That's as wide as I can go, but I've got my end piece down here and I've got another end piece here. This is going to be my little divider. This can be scraps, and I've got the 2 sides and the bottom. So I've threaded up with just some acrylic yarn here. I'm using a lot of leftovers, and I'm just going to just kind of eyeball where the middle of this bottom is. And I don't want to put it here because this is the shorter side. I want to match up the 34 holes, or excuse me, 35 holes across. So once I get it to about where I want it, I can use one of these little stitch markers to help me hold things together on one end while I get my yarn ready. I want to try to keep the holes straight, and I'm going to just tie a knot. All of this is going to be on the inside. It's not going to show once I have it on my shelf. You can be as neat as you want with this, but I'm just going to tie a couple of knots there just to secure it. And then I'm going to hold it to where it's comfortable for me. And I don't have to use every hole, so I'm just going to go every third hole or so and sew across the bottom. So what I usually do is I'll go back out the hole that I went through the bottom of the box. I'm just going to go out that empty hole right there that's straight across, and then skip a hole or two, and I'm going to sew this all the way to the other end, and I'm going to tie a knot on that end. And this wall should, this little barrier, this little divider, should be just free floating like this when I'm done. I'm just going to tie a knot on this end, just a couple of knots. It's not going to be a lot of stress, so I'm not too worried about it. And then I'll just run my tail under, which I should have trapped this other one on the other end, but again, it's not going to go anywhere. So that's done with the little divider. Alright, so I've got it laid out the way it's supposed to be. So what I want to do is just what I showed on the diagram on my computer at the beginning of the video. I'm going to start in one corner here. I'm going to come down this long side, and when I get here, I'm going to flip this out of the way so I don't accidentally sew through all that. I've done that before, but you want to leave this free. And then again, when I get here, I'll flip it out of the way, and I'll continue sewing down here, and then sew across this short end, and then back up and tie off at the far corner. And then all of my sides will have little hinges on them. Alright, so I'm going to take the two. I like to sew from this other side because then I don't have to worry about that flap. And then I'll take one of my little stitch markers and just secure that to keep it from flipping around, and then just sew this together. Tie a little knot to start off with. And this time I'm going to hide my tail. And you don't have to go through every hole, because it'll be secure enough if you do every other hole, or every 3 holes, every 4 holes. Just your choice. If you think you need more, then do that. So I'm going to finish sewing, hopefully without any knots. I'm going to finish sewing across this. Let me unfold it here. I'm going to finish sewing across this long side, short side, and then when I get to the other side, I'll meet back. I may stop and show you a little tip before I get to the end. Okay, here's my first little tip when sewing these together. Again, I've got my little flap here. I've got my side on the other side. I like to hang it over the edge of a table and stand up and do this because I can keep both hands free. And I've got this really heavy metal thing that's used for hammering wire. You can use a brick, a heavy book, or something like that. And it keeps me from tangling up my yarn because I'm usually working with a longer piece than that. So my hands are free. I hang this over the edge of my table, and it helps me to go faster. I will often do this even when I'm stitching the stitch pattern, because again, I'm starting off with a couple of yards of yarn, and then it tangles, so I can use my free hand to untangle those knots as I get to them. And I find this a lot easier on my neck and hands if I don't have to try to hold the pieces together. Alright, I'll continue sewing and I'll be right back. Alright, I'm coming up to my little divider. It's best to sew with this up so you don't forget about it on the other side. So now I'm going to flip it over to get it out of my way and continue sewing. Alright, I've reached this corner, so I like to just lay everything back out again so I can make sure that I've got all of this faced in the right direction. And just so you'll know where I am, here's my little divider. I'm going to pick this up, put that edge together right there, put my weight back down. I'm going to sew through this corner and keep going. I probably don't need my little stitch marker there because everything's pretty much not moving right now. But I do want to check every now and then that my holes are still lined up and that I haven't missed a hole. And I'm going to repeat that same thing whenever I get to this corner. I'm going to lay everything out. I'm going to check where my divider's at and continue sewing the long side of this additional side. Alright, I've just finished this last corner, so that's the last I need of this white yarn. So I'm just going to knot it and run my needle through a few stitches and trim that off. Right. Gonna lay everything out, and I flipped this over. You see my little fuzzies? I left them there so that we could tell what was the wrong side or the inside of the box. This is going to be the inside of the box. So this ugly side of the project here is going to be on the inside of the box, and that's really important because once we start sewing the next steps, we're going to be having to sew from the outside with these right sides together like this, and then we're going to have to flip it back up and make sure we're sewing in the orientation that it finally needs to be, because you won't be able to flip this back the other way if you sew it wrong. So I like to again lay everything out to where I know where it's important for me to always know where that is so that I don't sew it the wrong way. So I'm talking about this being the wrong side or the inside of the box. This is the wrong side and the inside of the box. Got all my ugly little fuzzies there. So I'm going to take this pretty side and I'm going to put it up against what I'm calling the outside of the box. So here's my divider. I've got the ugly side here and the ugly side here. I'm going to go ahead and line up my holes, making sure I have that on the 35 hole edge, and just pin it together. And I probably was out of the camera for part of that. So what I've got is the ugly side down, the ugly side up, and I've pinned the corner together. So you've got your pretty side facing down right here. So here's the bottom of the box, and I've got my pretty side facing down. Right, I've cut my yarn pretty long because I'm hoping not to run out. So I've still got it oriented like I told you. So I'm just going to bury my tail. And since this is a construction joint, I'm probably going to need to tie a knot at least at the end. But I want to join these two holes together. Let me go ahead and tie a simple knot. I want to make sure I'm on the end holes. I'm not wearing my reading glasses, so it's a little hard for me to see. So before I pull that down, I'm just going to make a little knot. That might help it to stay in place a little better. Alright, so I'm going to go back to my little method of just weighing this down, and I'm going to be stitching in every single hole, and I'm going to be more careful than I have been because I don't want to miss a hole and get this out of line. Trying to find that second hole. I don't want to miss one. Making sure I'm still lined up, and I'm not. There we go. So I'm going to go a lot slower on this edge, and I'll be back whenever I get to where my stitch marker is. Alright, I'm just going to park my needle for a second. So now it's time to flip this. This is very important. Flip it over so that the ugly side of your stitching here is to the inside of the box. So here's my little construction here. So that's very important because you won't be able to do it if you forget to do that. So I need this thread to be to the outside so that I can start stitching from the outside. So I'm just going to run my needle through that corner to the outside. And then I'm going to take my little stitch markers to help me make my little 3D box here. And it's going to help to have all these corners held together in the shape that they need to be. So it kind of saves, again, I'm always trying to prevent neck pain and hand pain and all of that, so I use all the helpers I can get. You can also just tie a little loose piece of string to hold them together if you don't have stitch markers. Use a bobby pin or something like that. I'm not worried about the divider at this point. So here we have our pretty side out, and this is where my yarn has left, my needle has left off on this corner. So I want to sew to the other end, and I actually like I like to sew like this, so I'm going to get that around through that corner again. So again, I use my little weight anywhere that it's going to help me. So I'm just going to put it down inside the box to kind of help it just stay still while I use my left hand to untangle yarn as I go, because I've still got quite a bit of yardage left on my needle. And then I'm just going to start sewing in every single hole, making sure every now and then that it's still lined up. Sometimes I'll go twice through the corner if there's not too much thread built up there, just to give it a little bit of extra coverage. But I'm going to keep going at this point. So I'll meet you back when I get to this corner right here. I'm sure it's obvious by now that I am using my pretty yarn to do all of the stitching on the front panel, because this will show on my shelf, and I am going through every hole so that I can cover as much of the plastic canvas as possible. So I'm going to go through this corner twice so I can try to cover up that plastic canvas. I don't know if I can go more than twice through there. Looks pretty good. And so now all I have to do across this top edge to get to the other corner is just to go through every hole, and that's going to go pretty fast because I'm not trying to sew two pieces together. I'm just trying to cover the plastic canvas. I'm sorry if my hand was in the way. So when I get to the other corner, I'm going to secure that, remove my stitch marker, and sew all the way to this end, and then tie a little knot that's not very noticeable. And sometimes I'll run my needle through to the inside of the basket and secure my thread on the inside. Alright, I'm just gonna push my needle through to the inside of the box and just try to find a place I can hide. I know you can't see what I'm doing. I'm just going to try to find a place to hide my threads inside some of these stitches. Maybe a little hard to get to. The other thing you can do is just on the outside of the box, you could just run your thread through some stitches. And I do it toward the back so it's not showing on the face of the box. Just run it through a few stitches, and then I'll bring it into the inside of the box, and if you're lucky, when you bring your needle in, it will go through some stitches. And then you just trim it off. So there, the face of my box is finished. So I'll just turn it over, and I don't need to videotape this because this is the bottom of the box, or the back end of the box, I'm sorry. So I'll go up one side, and so that I don't have to cut my yarn, I'll just kind of loosely skip 3 or 4 holes at a time, run my yarn across the back of this thing, and then sew down to the bottom corner. On this back end, I forgot to mention, I don't go through every hole. It's not necessary. So the same construction that I used here, just about every other hole, is going to be sufficient to hold this together. The only thing left to do is just to tie the top edge of this on. I think I might have enough yarn left over to tie a little knot. Just kind of line it up. You don't have to be real obsessive about it. And it doesn't need to be really strong because there's not a lot of pressure on this. You can sew it all the way through the canvas if you want to, but to me that's going to be a lot of trouble. So I'm just going to tie a couple of knots here. This is just acrylic yarn, so sometimes it does slip out. So you can use whatever you want to, even wire, to secure this, but I'm going to put some fray check on it so it doesn't come untied, and then I'm going to tack the other side just like that. And lastly, I'm going to show how I like to fold my fat quarters. Now you can use just a little square of cardstock that's going to not bind on the edges there. I'm using, it's about a 4.5 inch square. It doesn't really matter on that part. For me, I don't care if they're all exactly the same size. But if you want yours to be consistent, try to keep your fabric from sticking out the top and not rubbing too tightly on the sides. So the way I like to fold my fat quarters, here's the selvage edge over here. So if you fold it this way, it's a little bit thicker this way. These are the short ends of the fabric. So I've got this selvage to go by. So I fold it to where the selvage is all on the same side, and then I fold it again that way, and so it's a little bit more narrow across there. This one's been pre-washed, so it's a little crinkly. And then I just wind them up on here, and I like to use these little laundry clips. I got these on Amazon. I'm not sure exactly what they're called, but they're used to fold shirts and things. You can use, I wouldn't use bobby pins because they may rust, or you can just pin this down with a pin that won't rust over time. And that is ready to go in my box, and I don't want that upward because when I slide fabric in, I don't want it catching on that. So I turn it this way. And there you go.